let's imagine at the very beginning of the road to Compostela how this may start. A man walks into his home where his wife is doing wifely things, and he says, "My dear, I've been condemned to go on pilgrimage." And his wife looks up and says, "Oh, darling, where are you going?" And he says, "My dear, I'm going to Santiago de Compostela." And his wife looks sad and says, "Oh, my darling, I'll miss you so much." And he says, "I'll miss you, but I shall be back in 9 or 12 months. It's not long." So welcome and all aboard. We're off on this Santiago de Compostela train to the tomb of St. James in the Field of Stars. Santiago de Compostela is a World Heritage Centre, capital of Galicia in northwestern Spain. There are several ways of arriving in Santiago. On the left part, the western side of our map, Santiago de Compostela, the shrine of St. James in the Field of Stars. One could start in Paris or Vézelay or Limoges, Le Puy, Saint-Gilles-de-Gare, or anywhere which was convenient. Tradition attests to the missionary activity of James the Apostle, one of the 12 companions of Jesus Christ, who is believed to have preached the gospel in Spain in the 1st century. Such a proposition is not impossible, for a ship's journey would have brought people around the Mediterranean with ease. However, there is no direct archaeological evidence to the existence of St. James in Spain. Yet a number of traditions grew up. One claimed that a shepherd was guided by a star to the site of a tomb. The local bishop, Theodomir, identified the tomb as that of the apostle. King Alfonso II provided funds to build a church sometime between 813 and 830. He himself travelled from Orvieto in Asturias, thus establishing the Camino Primitiva, the oldest pilgrimage route. The city claimed to house the veil which covered the face of Christ in the tomb. In an era before widespread images such as we have today through magazines, TV, the internet, and so forth, such relics were of infinite importance. The artworks must have visually stunned the people who came from perhaps villages and hamlets with no solid buildings of stone, for they could never have seen anything as extraordinary as this. Soon pilgrims flocked from all over Galicia and beyond northern Spain. As the shrine's fame spread, pilgrims came from ever further reaches. While most travel for religious reasons, the shrine was also a focal point for Christians who resented the dramatic spread of Muslim settlers in Spain from the 8th century onwards. By the 10th century, various routes had been established along which pilgrims travelled. In the Middle Ages, religious orders began building across Europe, competing for the best relics as a way of attracting pilgrims and, of course, the money which they brought. Chartres claimed to house the girdle of Mary, Orvieto, the face towel which covered Jesus' face in the tomb, and so on. For some, a pilgrimage was an ecclesiastically approved way of seeing the world. Given the chance to undertake such a journey, many would gladly set out from their villages and towns to cross new terrain. New vistas opened up before them, and the opportunity to encounter new cultures, hear new music, learn new dances, speak new languages, try new foods, and experience a rush to the 5 senses. Pilgrims also sometimes embarked on the journey for penitential motives. Regularly, pilgrims were given the task of making the holy journey to expiate sins or even to satisfy transgression of the law. In the 15th century, the Inquisition was enormously spread throughout Spain, and several penitents were dispatched to Santiago to make reparation for their sins. Such enterprises were not without danger. Medieval manuscripts testify to the ever-present threat of illness and theft, and it was not uncommon for pilgrims to be murdered, perhaps in lieu of money or a few paltry possessions. For the most part, the approach to Santiago is on quite flat terrain, and the greatest challenge was for those crossing the Pyrenees. The pilgrim route goes through forests and winds along country roads. Depending on the time of the year, the Camino can be quiet or busy, but summer months are most popular. The town of Santiago, set in the northwest of Spain, is popular as a university town and the point of pilgrimage. The original church dates from the 9th century and was rebuilt several times throughout the centuries, with a wonderfully elaborate facade added in the mid-18th century. The highlight for the pilgrims is to attend Mass in the church, and such is a demand for places that pilgrims are asked to attend only once during their stay. At the end of Mass, a large thurible or silver container is filled with incense and swung through the transept. 5 cords are attached to the enormous chain and pulley. Plumes of grey-blue smoke swirl up, perfuming the air. The pulley allows the huge botafumero swing into action. As one of the men swinging the large container counts to 5, the quintet shovels back, and with a flick, the thurible is hoisted into the air. Although incense is used in the religious rituals, the real reason for swinging the thurible above the crowds is to fumigate the air. These people have walked hundreds of miles across varied terrain. Washing facilities were basic, most simply washed in streams or rivers without the benefit of soap. The incense heightened not only the sense of excitement and spectacle, but covered a myriad of odors from the mingling crowds. As the journey to Santiago comes to an end, people have in their mind's eye the extraordinary experiences, the places which they've seen, the friendships which they have forged. sermons in which preachers expounded on the tenets of Christianity, urging them to reform and to better their lives, and to press forward to the shrine of St. James. It's estimated that on any one day during the Middle Ages, over 40,000 people passed through the Cathedral of Burgos along the Camino of Santiago. These churches and the art therein were built on the pennies of the pilgrims. According to an early legend, the body of the saint was set into a boat, a rudderless boat, and set sail. It was discovered, brought to the Bishop Theodomir, who arranged for its burial and built a church. And over the centuries, the legend of James was politicized, so that he was no longer simply a peaceful apostle, but he was the scourge of the Muslim rulers who had moved into Spain in the middle of the 8th century. The Battle of Calvillo, a spurious battle between a Christian and Moorish army, was one which took place in which St. James appeared to kill the Moors. The battle never took place. It was simply a story of propaganda. Muslim armies had entered Spain in 711, and Islamic rule spread across the peninsula. St. James was venerated under the dubious title Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer. The Muslims poured across the Straits of Gibraltar and settled in the south of the peninsula, and remained in control of the kingdoms of Granada, of Seville, of Cordoba, of Jaén, and all the southernmost district, until in 1492 the Moors and Jews were expelled under the orders of Queen Isabel of Spain and her husband, King Ferdinand. A very important and popular point of meeting was at the Tower of Saint-Jacques in Paris. The tower was built in the early part of the 16th century. Today, all that we see of the tower is this flamboyant Gothic pinnacle which rises up beside where the church was. The Butchers' Guild paid for the erection of the tower between 1509 and 1523. The church was demolished in 1793 during the French Revolution. The pilgrims generally changed their pilgrim's outfit and wore a brown cape with a broad-brimmed cap, with the shell of St. James to identify them as pilgrims. Having recited prayers and received a blessing from the cleric in charge of the day's activities, they set off on their first day's journey. Most walked on foot, while mules or even horses were available for groups or wealthy people to carry food and clothing. Most of the pilgrims travelled on their own, but they soon joined up with groups of language or of culture or of country of origin, so that they would have companionship and protection. Most walked on foot, and only the rich, the wealthy, the aristocrats, the clergy were able to use a mule or to use other forms of transport, a cart, a carriage, a coach. The pilgrims generally carried little more than a walking staff or water bottle with a gourd. They said goodbye to their own land, their family and friends, knowing that they would be gone for months. And when they returned, if they returned, many would not be there. People move on. Experience changes us. The reason for pilgrimages were many and varied. Some went for devotional reasons, others to expiate a sin, others still in search of a cure from illness or perhaps an act of thanksgiving. A number went, of course, for the sheer adventure. Society at the time was feudal, meaning that a vast number of people lived close to poverty, supporting an aristocracy. Or one could argue that the aristocracy supported the poor. Most people lived on the land, and in today's terms, even the aristocracy and the highly wealthy lived relatively modestly. Pilgrims saw many wondrous sights on their journeys. One of the most popular was the Church of Saint Foy or Saint Faith in Conques, in central France. Saint Foy or Saint Faith was, according to legend, believed to have died during a persecution ordered by the Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century. Her body was buried in Aquitaine, but in the 9th century, it was stolen by a monk from Conques. Such was the trade in relics. In 866, a church was built on the pilgrimage route to Santiago, which we see here, which was just beginning as the pilgrim sanctuary. Over the door of the Abbey Church was a vast tympanum. It depicts the Last Judgment and reminds the faithful that at the end of their lives they will face God's judgment. The majority of Europeans at the time were Christians, and indeed Europe was called the heart of Christendom. The vast polychrome sculpture enthralled the pilgrims, most of whom could never have seen such a work of art in their lives. Jesus sits in the center as the great judge. This, of course, is the forerunner of the Last Judgment painted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel between 1534 and 1541. To the right, Jesus points to the damned, lowering his left hand. The damned are led to hell and eternal punishment, while to his other side, the just are led on to paradise. Here, demons inflict tortures. In the lower left corner, we see a demon pushing the condemned into the mouth of a monster. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus, is hanged from a tree, a reminder to pilgrims of the value of fidelity to the Christian faith. Demons inflict punishment on the souls of the damned, and here a dog-like devil pulls the hair of a startled sinner. Satan, the prince of devils, provides over the day of punishment in hell. Two demons hold a sinner strapped to a pole over the flames of eternal punishment. The pilgrims must have been fascinated by the sheer movement. Preachers stood at the door, admonishing pilgrims who were about to enter the church to live worthy lives and continue their journey. St. Paul, St. Peter, and Mary the Virgin, from left to right, flank Jesus the judge. The bishop leads the king into the presence of Christ. The pilgrims' money contributed to the construction of vast churches along the route of St. James. The gold statue of St. Foy was covered by gems, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, amethysts, all offered by the wealthier pilgrims. Such statues began their lives as simple wooden carvings, and over the centuries were encrusted with jewels of devotion. The road was followed by thousands each day. The pilgrim was granted the protection of civil authorities. It is estimated that in the High Middle Ages, 400,000 people passed along the road. Often paying a small coin to use the facility of the bridge. The toll allowed the owners become very wealthy in the district. Each day, the pilgrim walked several miles and at night took refuge in the small hostels run by monks. The majority of those making the journey, of course, were men, because women in a feudal society were obliged to stay at home. The hostels were free of charge and food was provided. Any medical needs would be attended to before the pilgrim set out the next day. The goal of the pilgrimage was the Church of St. James. The pilgrims, weary as they may have been, entered through the Door of Glory, which had been built in the 12th century. The Portico of Glory was built by the master mason Matteo, who carved the portico on the orders of King Ferdinand II of Leon in the middle of the 12th century. It comprises of some 200 sculptures and is the high point of Spanish Romanesque art. Originally painted in polychrome colors, it was repainted until the 18th century. The tympanum is similar to that which we saw at Conques. 4 figures hold musical instruments: a harp, a mandolin, a stringed triangular instrument plucked with a plectrum. These remind us of the importance of music, most of which has been lost. We can only imagine what the hurly-burly must have sounded like as the pilgrims swarmed through the door, singing hymns in a heightened sense of drama and excitement at the prospect of reaching their goal. And throughout the long journey, the pilgrims learned more and more about their faith as they gazed upon the sculptures and listened to the sermons which were preached at the various stops. One of the most important documents which contains the history of the pilgrimage of Santiago is the Codex Calixtus, which was written in the 12th century, recounting the life of St. James, prayers in his honor, and various legends, one of which gives us the account of St. James, the slayer of the Moors. But the pilgrimage eventually came to an end and people were allowed to move forward. But on the return journey, they also had to carry a passport to prove that they had been there. Pilgrimages have really become popular so much in the last 40 or 50 years. In 1983, Pope John Paul II gave a fresh impetus to the pilgrimage when he visited Santiago, and stopping some miles outside the city, he decided to make the last portion of his trip on foot. And it was because of the media exposure that so many tour operators now offer various methods of traveling along the ancient Camino. Some people walk, some people cycle, some people take horses. Some tour operators arrange for backpacks or cases to be carried from one place to the other. A more modern development is carrying on to an area called Finisterre, the end of the earth. Because in the medieval mind, this was the point where the sun set. And keep in mind, perhaps we're going back to an era when those believed that the earth was flat. And they pondered on how the sun would sink into the ocean and rise the next morning in an everlasting cycle. And today, very often, people burn their boots or some of their clothes as a sign of their new beginning, and then turn around to make their way home.